I'm Margaret Jennings, 74, a widow from Charleston who was supposed to fade quietly into lace curtains and sympathy cards. Instead, I turned a Thanksgiving smile into a federal case. By the end of this story, a man who tried to erase me will be learning what concrete walls sound like at night. And you'll know exactly how a so-called helpless widow erased his freedom. Thanksgiving should have tasted like cinnamon and memory, but that year it tasted like varnish and performance. I sat at the far end of my daughter Julia's long mahogany table, a place that felt suspiciously like the sidelines. Chase, my son-in-law, moved through the room with the confidence of a host who believed he'd upgraded the family brand. His smile was the first alarm bell, polished, practiced, resting on his face the way a couch tag rests on a couch, meant to impress, not to comfort. I watched him carve the turkey with theatrical precision, offer compliments that sounded rehearsed, and glide between guests as if he were auditioning for a role no one else had applied for. Julia, meanwhile, drifted past me in a haze of hostess fatigue, the kind of tired that comes from carrying tension in elegant silence. She touched my shoulder lightly when she passed, but her eyes were elsewhere, hovering over some invisible checklist, making sure no one mentioned things that might disrupt the curated calm. Hints began floating across the table like polite napkins. Comments about my well-being, subtle assessments of how I was managing alone, casual mentions of how big my house must feel without Robert. Each remark wore the costume of concern, yet beneath it, I heard the scrape of a chair being pulled out from under me. The implication was clear. I was becoming an administrative inconvenience, a lovable relic that needed reorganizing. The seating arrangement didn't help. I wasn't exiled outright, but I was certainly not centered. From where I sat, I had a perfect view of the floral centerpiece and the backs of people's heads. Conversation slid over me, not to me. And when I spoke, I felt the slight pause people use when they're not sure if they should listen or redirect. My stories about Robert, once welcomed like heirloom dishes, now seemed to make the air heavier. I felt the unspoken request, leave the past in the past, especially if it complicates the present narrative. So I stopped speaking and started observing. I noticed how Chase touched Julia's elbow when certain topics drifted near my name. I noticed how his eyes flicked to me when someone mentioned estates or insurance. I noticed how quickly he filled silences with jokes, with plans, with that gentle, rapt authority that says, "Let me handle it," before anyone realizes it includes you. The food was perfect. The atmosphere was warm. The performance was airtight. And still, beneath the music and candlelight, a cold current ran. I recognized it because I've stood in colder waters, hospital waiting rooms, funeral homes, empty kitchens in the soft blue of dawn. This wasn't grief. Grief is honest. This was strategy. When dessert came out, I excused myself under the pretense of needing a moment. In the hallway mirror, I saw a woman they thought was too tired to notice she was being ushered toward the edges. I adjusted my pearl earring, smoothed my dress, and looked myself straight in the eye. I decided to let them keep thinking that, for now. I returned to the table, smiled at the right moments, dabbed at my eyes when someone mentioned family, and let the evening close with hugs and leftovers. But as I wrapped a slice of pumpkin pie in foil, I tucked something else away, a confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a passing thought. It was a plan, one I hadn't been invited to review. I left that night with my coat around my shoulders and a quiet flame in my chest. They believed they had begun a gentle transition. What they didn't realize was that the person they were trying to move off stage was already scripting the second act.
The days after Thanksgiving felt like a house where someone keeps opening windows you didn't know were there. Drafts of suggestions slipping in from odd angles. Concern began dressing itself in routine. I noticed how information was placed in my path, the way breadcrumbs are scattered for a distracted bird. Pamphlets about active senior living, brochures with smiling gray-haired couples playing pickleball, gentle articles left open on tablets about simplifying life after loss. None of it was accidental. I could feel the choreography. A phone call arrived with the soft tone people use when trying not to sound like they're pushing. I was told that a retirement community might be safer, more social, less lonely. The idea was presented as if it had occurred naturally to my daughter and her husband over coffee, not brewed in a meeting about my future without me. A suggestion drifted in my direction that handling bills, home maintenance, doctor visits, and insurance paperwork might be overwhelming. I was informed that Chase was very good with finances. The sentence hung in the air like perfume, pleasant but suffocating when it lingers too long. I walked through my home that afternoon, touching the backs of chairs and picture frames, feeling the ridges of Robert's old desk beneath my fingers. Every object in that house held context no outsider could replicate. A scratch on the banister from when Julia crashed a laundry basket down the stairs. The dent in the hallway baseboard where Robert misjudged the sofa he swore he could move alone. The faint water ring on an end table from a night he forgot a coaster, but remembered to rub my shoulders. The suggestion that I trade this history for a generic apartment with floral drapes and scheduled bingo felt like treason dressed up as practicality. I recognized the pattern, because it wasn't new. I'd seen it after Robert died, when people tried to empty my closets before I'd opened them, when they told me storing memories was unhealthy while they boxed up my life without asking. That time, I was grieving too deeply to fight every hand reaching for a drawer. Now I was clear-eyed, and clarity is a blade. I monitored the tempo of their efforts. The first hint was subtle, the second more pressing, the third came edged with urgency. The narrative they were crafting painted me as a woman sliding downhill, and every new suggestion came pre-packaged with a solution that involved less of me and more of them. I understood. They were building justification. Once the story of my fragility took root, the signatures would look like compassion instead of theft. So I adjusted my own performance. I allowed a mislaid key here, a delayed return call there, small gestures that told them what they wanted to believe while I documented their momentum. I made tea and let it steep too long while jotting notes in the margin of a crossword, dates, phrases, moments when their eyes flickered a little too quickly. I wasn't simply observing. I was constructing a record of intention. There was a moment when the weight of it pressed down. The idea that my daughter could be enlisted in this, not as a villain, but as a pawn. I felt the ache of that, let it pass through me, then set it down. Love can be manipulated. Awareness cannot. I chose awareness. By the end of that week, I knew 3 things for certain. First, the campaign to ease me out of my own authority was fully underway. Second, Chase was the architect, and Julia was the bridge he walked across. Third, if I pushed too soon, I would look defensive, erratic, exactly the role they were scripting for me. So I waited. I let the whispers gather until they became loud enough to record. I let the paper trail unfurl until it could be wrapped back around the hands that set it in motion. I let the image of their version of me calcify just enough that, when it cracked, the sound would carry. People think age blunts instinct. What it actually does, if you allow it, is sharpen patience. And patience, when paired with a plan, is a weapon most predators never see coming. I spent those days polishing mine.
The folder didn't arrive with drama. It simply existed on my kitchen table one late afternoon, as ordinary as a grocery list and twice as dangerous. Manila, smooth, uncreased, placed at the precise spot where I rest my teacup each morning. It felt staged to be accidentally seen, but nothing about it was accidental. The weight of it in my hands told me it carried more than paper. It carried intention. I slid it open and met a parade of polite phrases dressed in serif fonts, headings about safety, efficiency, continuity, paragraphs dripping with benevolence, each one crafted to sound like a hug that somehow tightened as you relaxed into it. The further I read, the clearer the pattern became. Every sentence guided authority away from me and toward Chase, like a series of small arrows no one expected an old woman to trace. The tone was strategic. It used reassurance as a lever, wrapped control in the language of care, and relied heavily on the assumption that grief dulls comprehension. My name appeared repeatedly, but not as owner, only as subject, the person to be managed, protected, repositioned. The pages spoke of emergencies I hadn't declared, incapacity I hadn't shown, burdens I hadn't asked anyone to carry. Legal phrasing is a kind of music, and I've heard enough of it to know when a song is in a minor key. Words like streamline, authorize, and transfer appeared in a rhythm too consistent to be benign. There was a quiet attempt to rename my independence as liability and my autonomy as inefficiency. I could feel the hands that drafted these lines, steady, practiced, sure they'd never be caught. I pressed my fingers over the ink as if to test whether it might smudge. It didn't. This wasn't impulsive. It was rehearsed. Someone had taken the time to craft a roadmap that ended with me politely stepping off my own property and thanking them for the ride. I noticed the typography shrink halfway down one page, a familiar trick. Hide the vitals where tired eyes skip. My breath slowed. I didn't need to understand every clause to sense that one of them carried the real poison. It was there, buried like a thorn under silk, waiting for a signature to push it in deep. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a bird tapped the window as if to remind me time was passing. I closed the folder and rested my palms on top of it, feeling the pulse in my wrists. This wasn't charity. It was conquest written in cursive. I didn't rage. Rage is loud and brief. I chose something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. I cataloged the scent of the paper, the weight of the staples, and the order of the pages. Evidence, I reminded myself, has texture. When I finally rose, I placed the folder back on the table exactly where I'd found it. Let them believe I was still considering it. Let them think the performance continued as scripted. I already knew what came next. I would need a second pair of eyes sharper than mine and a way to turn their own draft into a detonator. The clause was in there. I could feel it like a splinter under skin. And I was going to pull it out on my terms. I read the papers the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, slowly, hunting for the shadow that doesn't belong. The kitchen was dim, except for the cone of light above the table, and the quiet felt intentional, like the house itself was holding its breath with me. Page after page promised protection, efficiency, peace of mind. The words were soft, but their arrangement was a blade. Halfway down page 5, the print shrank, just enough to slide past tired eyes. There it was, the pulse beneath the paper,
a clause that transferred full legal and financial authority to Chase the moment my pen touched the line. No contingency, no waiting for a doctor's note, no emergency trigger. It was not a net in case I fell. It was a trap door activated by trust. One stroke of ink and I would vanish from my own accounts, my own decisions, my own life. I let the sentence sit inside me until its true weight registered. It wasn't just control they wanted, it was silence. Legal, binding, irreversible silence. A future where my questions could be dismissed as confusion and my protests categorized as decline. I could almost hear the narrative forming. Concerned husband, overwhelmed daughter, frail mother, unfortunate necessity. I had seen people boxed into roles before. I refused to let someone nail the lid shut on mine. Memory rose like a tide. Robert and I had built our stability brick by quiet brick. Decades of decisions, careful savings, late-night negotiations with fate. He used to say that the most dangerous thieves are the ones who hand you the bag and ask you to pack it yourself. I felt the truth of that in my bones as I traced the ink with my eyes. Chase had handed me the bag, monogrammed it with my initials, and expected gratitude when I filled it with everything I owned. I pressed my fingertips to the table to steady myself. Anger would have been easy, loud, gratifying, messy. I didn't choose anger. I chose precision. This clause wasn't a suggestion, it was evidence. This moment wasn't a crisis, it was a beginning. I gathered the pages, lined them up edge to edge, and slid them back into the folder with the care of someone folding a map she intends to reverse. In that pool of kitchen light, I made a private promise. I would not be the woman they described in their whispering. I would not be softened into compliance by the weight of my own grief. If they wanted a signature, they would get one, but not the one they drafted. I would sign my own plan into motion. The clock over the stove clicked to the next minute, a small reminder that timing is everything. I knew I needed an ally who understood both law and war crafted in ink, someone who could read the music of manipulation and hum the tune backward. I already had her name in mind. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and let the dark settle. The house felt different now, not haunted, but armed. I walked down the hallway, running my fingers over the photographs of a life I was not about to surrender. At the bedroom door, I paused and looked back toward the kitchen where the papers lay like a sleeping animal. They believed they had hidden the wolf in legal wool. I had just learned how to skin it. Tomorrow would not be about confrontation. Tomorrow would be about confirmation. Their claws screamed trouble. Mine would whisper justice. And when it spoke, it would be heard in a courtroom, not a kitchen. I slipped into bed, not to rest, but to sharpen. Patience became my lullaby. Strategy, my heartbeat. The trap they built had a flaw. It required me to be blind. I went to sleep with my eyes wide open.
I knew better than to march into a battle alone. Grief had taught me that isolation is a predator's favorite terrain. Strategy prefers company, especially the kind of company that files motions instead of murmurs. So, I reached for a name I hadn't needed since Robert died, a name I kept tucked in a Rolodex the world thought was outdated: Elaine Gibbons. Elaine was more than my late husband's law partner. She was the blade he kept sheathed for emergencies. Years ago, I'd covered for her in a moment that could have ruined her career: a misfiled prenup, a shaky client, and a bottle of bourbon as currency. She'd told me then that if I ever needed a hammer, she would swing without asking where the nail came from. I decided to collect. I didn't call her out of panic. Panic gets you slammed doors and sloppy decisions. I called her out of clarity. I explained what I'd seen, what I'd read, what I suspected, carefully, calmly, like laying out evidence on velvet. I described the claws that handed Chase everything, and the choreography of concern they'd been performing around me. She didn't rush to reassure. Elaine never wasted words on the obvious. I could almost feel her expression tightening over the phone. She understood immediately. This wasn't misguided help. It was a hostile acquisition written in cursive. The next day, I drove to her office, a familiar brick building that still smelled faintly of ink and ambition. The lobby hadn't changed. Neither had she. Elaine greeted me with that same unflinching poise. Lipstick sharp, eyes sharper. I placed the folder on her desk like a loaded object and watched her dissect it, line by line. Her finger paused over page 5, the same place mine had. She murmured something about malice hiding behind margins. No drama, just diagnosis. Together we shifted from shock to structure. Confrontation would only feed their narrative, the fragile widow lashing out, confused and defensive. Confirmation was cleaner. We needed Chase to demonstrate intent, in his own words, act on his assumptions, and cross the legal line willingly. Our plan became a mirror, not a weapon. He would walk himself into the reflection. We would simply document it. I called in a favor of her own, a tech friend with quiet shoes and clever hands. Within hours, my house transformed. The cozy living room became a set layered with invisibility, a pinhole camera in a lamp base, another in a vent grate, a microphone hidden beneath porcelain. Nothing invasive, nothing obvious, just truth catchers tucked inside my life. I adjusted the scenery, too. A slightly crooked frame here, a stack of mail left unsorted on purpose, a cushion off-center. Enough to whisper vulnerability, not shout it. Let him see what he wanted. Let him find weakness where there was only staging. I rehearsed my role that night. Not the helpless act he expected, but a careful version of it. A little forgetful, a little overwhelmed, grateful for guidance. Not too much raises suspicion, but just enough to stroke his confidence. Confidence is a leash. Predators tug it on themselves. Elaine laid out the legal backbone. Once he moved to seize control, submitted paperwork, initiated transfers, or filled in gaps we intentionally left open, we would spring the case. Not with drama, but with documentation. Evidence beats emotion in court, even when emotion is what saved you. As I drove home, evenings settling over Charleston like a silk shawl, I felt something I hadn't since Robert died. Partnership. Not the romantic kind, but the kind built of grit and quiet nods in dim rooms. I wasn't alone. I was armed, with knowledge, with allies, with a plan carved from patience and precision. I slept that night with the calm of a woman who had traded fear for focus. The folder still sat on my kitchen table, but now it looked different. It wasn't a threat anymore, it was a prop. Tomorrow, the performance would continue. His, not mine. And this time, every line he delivered would belong to me.
I turned my home into a stage, the way a seamstress turns fabric into armor, quietly, stitch by stitch.
Elaine's tech friend moved like a shadow, leaving behind nothing but certainty. A pinhole lens disappeared into the hollow of a lamp base, another into the vent grill above the mantel, a third into the spine of a decorative book that no one had opened in years. A microphone rested beneath a porcelain vase that had belonged to Robert's mother. For once, its fragility served me. Once the hardware was in place, I focused on atmosphere. Predators read rooms long before they read people, so I gave the room the story I wanted him to believe. A family photo sat just off center, as if I hadn't noticed. A small stack of unopened mail lay in the wrong tray. One kitchen cabinet door was left ajar. The couch cushions were slightly uneven, and a sweater draped over the armrest suggested a mind that forgot where it had left things. None of it was chaotic. Chaos alarms control freaks. This was curated imperfection, a portrait of soft decline. Light mattered. I raised the blinds a fraction too high in the den, letting the afternoon sun wash out the space and blur edges. In the kitchen, I left one bulb unscrewed, so the overhead fixture hummed faintly. It all whispered a message. She is alone, she is tired, she is ready to hand over the reins. Then I rehearsed myself, not the truth, but the version of me he expected. I practiced a slightly slower way of setting down a cup, a soft laugh that carried apology instead of confidence, and a pause long enough after a question to suggest I was thinking harder than I should have. I let my handwriting wobble just a little when I made a grocery list. I even misfiled a receipt where I knew he might glimpse it if he helpfully tidied my counter. When Chase arrived, the doorbell sounded like a cue. I welcomed him with gratitude that tasted like dust on my tongue. He moved through the living room with that same managerial ease, taking in the room the way an appraiser surveys assets. I guided him to the armchair placed perfectly within the camera's overlapping fields of view. Tea was already poured, steam curled upward as if the room itself exhaled relief at his presence. He presented revised paperwork with a smile engineered to soothe. He assured me that this version was simpler, more humane, designed for those inevitable days when decisions might feel heavy. He did not notice how my fingers steadied themselves on the arm of the chair before reaching for the pages. He didn't catch the way I kept my breathing even as I skimmed, eyes wider than usual to mimic confusion. He believed I was under strain. He believed I needed him. Every sentence he offered, every reassurance he layered with concern, drifted into the microphones like gifts. He outlined how streamlined things would be once authority transferred, how protected I would feel, how much easier it would be for Julia if he could just handle the practical matters. He used words like burden and relief as if they were interchangeable. He framed my independence as weight, his control as kindness. I nodded in the right places, let my shoulders sag at the right moments, allowed my eyes to water. Grief is an inexhaustible well when you know how to draw from it. Inside, I was counting the number of times he referenced inevitability, counting how often he tapped the signature line in a casual, rhythmic pattern, counting which phrases would resonate best with a jury when they heard them played back. When he finally stood to leave, he did so with the confidence of a man who believed the paperwork and the person were in his pocket. He set his leather folder under his arm with the kind of satisfaction you can almost hear. I walked him to the door, thanked him with softness, and watched his car pull away through curtains I had left just so, thin enough to see, thick enough to appear private. The moment his taillights vanished, I moved through the house like a general after a battle, checking each position, verifying the capture. I pressed the concealed switch beneath the vase. A tiny indicator blinked once, confirming the recording had stopped. I called Elaine with a calm report, not of panic, but of progress. We cataloged what he had said, how he had said it, and what steps he would likely take next. It was no longer guesswork. It was a timeline. That night, I packed away the trembling act and let stillness take over. The house felt different, no longer a vulnerable space, but a documented one. The folder on my table had company now, a hard drive humming quietly in a hidden drawer, holding truth spoken in a voice that thought it was safe. He believed he had orchestrated the opening moves. He hadn't realized I had built the stage and controlled the lighting, the sound, and the script. The performance was recorded. The audience, eventually, would be 12 strangers sworn to listen. I went to bed steady, not because the danger had passed, but because proof had arrived. Tomorrow would bring the slip, the moment arrogance outruns caution. I didn't need to chase him there. I only needed to be ready when he crossed the line. He thought he was guiding me toward surrender. I had just guided him into frame.
The proof I needed arrived the way arrogance usually does, unguarded and loud. I had stepped into the hallway under the harmless pretense of freshening up, leaving Chase alone in my living room, precisely where the microphones were strongest. He believed I was out of range. He believed the house was as unobservant as the woman he thought he was managing. He made a call the moment my footsteps faded. His voice dropped into that confidential cadence men use when they think control is a foregone conclusion. He reported progress like a project manager closing a phase. The papers nearly secured, Julia sufficiently convinced, timing on our side. He outlined the assets as if inventorying stolen art, the house, the accounts, the heirlooms, each item categorized as something that would transition smoothly once signatures were finalized. He framed my consent as inevitable and my awareness as irrelevant. He assured whoever was on the other end that I would not see it coming. I stood still, just beyond the doorway, listening to the architecture of his confidence. Every sentence tightened the net around him, not me. The recorder didn't miss a syllable. Neither did I. It wasn't just what he said, it was how casually he said it. The ease with which he placed me in the past tense of my own life. He believed manipulation was an act of care, and that theft could be spun as protection, provided the target looked tired enough. When he ended the call, I let a beat pass, long enough to suggest I'd been gone for more than the length of a conversation, short enough to keep the illusion of my presence nearby. I returned to the room with the same soft gratitude I'd worn since this performance began, and he relaxed into it like a man satisfied with his own reflection. The moment he left, I disengaged the hidden switch beneath the porcelain vase, watched the tiny indicator blink to confirm the recording was saved, and called Elaine. We broke his words down like forensic analysts. Intent, timeline, co-conspirator,
financial objective implied coercion. Each piece clicked into place on the larger board. There was no longer speculation, only documentation. That night the house felt steady in a way it hadn't since Robert died. Not peaceful. Peace is what you feel when danger has passed. This was composure, the kind that settles in when the truth sits on your side of the table, stamped and time-coded. I brewed tea and let it steep to strength, the way Robert liked it, and I thought about the sheer simplicity of the error Chase had made. Predators rarely imagined their prey turning the lights on. I tucked the bribe into a safe place and mentally moved to the next step. There was no need to gloat, no satisfaction in catching him mid-scheme, only a clean, clinical readiness. He had declared his plan into my living room air. Now the law would breathe it in. He believed I wouldn't hear. He believed I wouldn't understand. He believed I wouldn't act. What he didn't believe, what he never even considered, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment. He hung himself with his own sentences. All I did was make sure the knot held.
I decided the cleanest way to end his performance was to host one of my own. A quiet dinner. Intimate, familiar, and staged to look like surrender. I invited Julia and Chase with the softness of a mother eager to make peace. I chose a night that felt ordinary, the kind of evening when people's guards lower with the sun. The house smelled like rosemary and roasted chicken by the time they arrived. I set Robert's wedding china on the table, polished the silver until it caught candlelight like small flames, and folded the napkins the way my mother taught me, when formality meant respect, not strategy. The playlist was low and nostalgic, a score that said home and not ambush. Every detail signaled comfort, care, and the illusion that I had finally accepted the help that was being offered. I kept my demeanor easy, unthreatening, grateful. I let my shoulders drop and my laugh soften. I shifted the conversation towards small memories and let my sentences trail off in places where he would expect uncertainty. All the while, the real work sat between us, disguised as paperwork. His original packet now blended seamlessly with the one Elaine and I had revised. The nullification clause lay buried like a fuse. If coercion or manipulation ever surfaced, the entire agreement would implode and turn his actions into evidence. When the moment felt right, dessert on the table, Julia relaxed at last, and Chase gleaming with quiet triumph, I produced the documents. I framed the act as relief, not capitulation. I let them see me steady a shaking hand as though the weight of responsibility was finally too much. I signed where he expected, tracing my name with deliberate care, and slid the papers back across the table with a smile engineered to look like trust. He didn't read the revisions. Confidence had blinded him to the possibility of a countermove. He tucked the folder under his arm the way a man tucks away a future he thinks he owns. He lifted his glass in a toast to the years ahead. I met it with one to the truth, a truth he didn't realize was already notarized by his own arrogance. Throughout the evening, Julia watched me closely, her eyes searching for something I wasn't ready to give her yet. Explanation, vindication, the terrible relief of knowing she had been duped. I gave her warmth instead.
Her awakening would need to come with evidence, not accusation. Tonight wasn't about exposing him to her. It was about letting him expose himself to the law. As they left, I walked them to the door, hugged my daughter, and felt the tension in her shoulders, loyalty tangling with doubt. I let Chase thank me, usher her out, and beam like a man who had just sealed a deal. The door closed softly behind them, but the sound rang in my chest like a gavel. I stood alone in the quiet afterward, letting the candles burn down. The table looked like an aftermath, plates smudged with dinner and victory, cutlery resting like surrendered weapons. I gathered everything slowly, methodically, sealing the night in muscle memory. The clink of china, the slide of silver, the weight of the folder that was no longer mine to carry. I envisioned the next morning like a chess move already played. He would act. The bank would call. The claws would detonate. The trap would not spring with noise. It would click shut with cold precision. When the last dish was washed and put away, I placed a copy of the signed packet in a drawer I never used and slipped the original into Elaine's waiting hands via a late-night drop. The house exhaled. So did I. He believed he had secured my obedience. What he had secured was a timestamp. He believed he had silenced me with signatures. What he had collected were the receipts of his own intent. The dinner was his celebration. It was, in truth, the autopsy of his plan.
The trigger came exactly as expected, quietly, efficiently, and with the arrogance of someone certain the road was clear. A few mornings after the dinner, the bank reached out to verify a sweeping authorization Chase had attempted to execute: full access transfers, beneficiary changes, a consolidation of assets into channels he controlled. His move was swift, almost elegant, the way a thief moves when he believes the house is empty. That single action was the pressure point our hidden claws had been waiting for. Elaine moved the pieces the moment I relayed the details. The recordings were cataloged, the documents time-stamped, the revised clause highlighted, the attempted transfer captured in the bank's own system. What had been a family matter in whispered tones now crystallized into a criminal case in black and white. We weren't pleading for understanding anymore. We were presenting evidence. I felt a stillness settle over me as the formal filings were made. Attempted fraud, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fiduciary manipulation. The words sounded clinical on paper, but to me they translated to something simpler. Proof that I had not imagined the shifting ground beneath my feet. Proof that strategy beats sentiment when sentiment is weaponized against you. That afternoon, I walked through my house with a steadiness I hadn't felt since before Robert died. The walls no longer felt like a place where plans were made behind my back. They felt like a record of what had been protected: my name, my legacy, my autonomy. I placed the bank's notice beside the revised packet in a drawer, closed it gently, and let the click of wood on wood mark the end of that chapter. The waiting that followed wasn't charged with fear. It was measured with purpose. Chase would learn what it meant to move in a world where every shortcut is mapped, every manipulation mirrored back, and every step forward documented. He had set the clock running. Now the second hand clicked in my favor.
I brewed tea and let it sit until it was strong enough to bite. The steam rose in steady tendrils, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a signal. It felt like warmth. The trap had not snapped with the theatrics of a bear trap. It had closed with the quiet certainty of a vault door sealing shut. He had reached for everything. All he grabbed was a handle wired to his own downfall.
They came on a Thursday, the kind of late afternoon when the light turns the edges of everything to gold. I was in the kitchen, listening to the kettle hum when the doorbell cut through the quiet with a tone that felt official rather than social. I had been expecting the moment, not the sound. Anticipation steadies the hands. Surprise tests the heart. My hands stayed steady. 2 officers stood on the porch, posture careful, expressions neutral, the practiced calm of people who deliver consequences for a living. Their presence confirmed what paperwork had already promised. This was no longer an uncomfortable family dispute. It was a criminal matter with case numbers and evidence logs. They explained the next steps in measured tones, but I already knew the rhythm. Our filings had moved. The system was responding. I felt something inside me unclench. Not relief exactly, but validation, the kind that settles deeper than satisfaction. Across town, almost simultaneously, another set of officers walked into Chase's glass-walled office. The space he loved for its transparency finally reflected him without his control. Interns stared. Colleagues pretended not to. He had always moved like a man rehearsing for applause. The silence that greeted him now was a different kind of audience. He leaned on the words he'd always trusted: misunderstanding, intention, protection, only to find they dissolved against recorded statements and embedded clauses. There is a softness to lies when they're spoken in living rooms. There is a hard edge to them when they're replayed in courtrooms. Back at my house, paperwork changed hands. I signed where it mattered and watched as copies were sealed, initialed, placed into folders that would travel further than any holiday card. I noticed the details because details had saved me. The badge numbers, the timestamp on a form, the careful way an officer tucked the evidence list into a sleeve. Procedure has a sound: soft clicks, the rasp of paper, the murmur of confirmation. It was almost comforting. Chaos had been replaced by process. When the officers left, the house felt larger, not emptier, truer. The kitchen table, once crowded with deception, now held only a teacup and a vase of wilting hydrangeas. I let the kettle whistle longer than usual before pouring, savoring the normalcy of careless noise. For weeks, I had curated every movement, every expression, every misplaced object. Now, with the machinery of justice in motion, I could let the spoon clink against china without wondering who was listening. Julia arrived just as the sky shifted from gold to blue. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone waking from a dream she didn't choose. She moved toward me slowly, as if testing the ground between us. I could see the realization working its way through her, the guilt her not seeing, the shame for participating, however unknowingly, in the script he wrote. I guided her to the porch, where the air felt clearer than any room inside. We sat together without speaking. Words would have salted wounds still open. Instead, I offered silence as a salve and presence as a promise. She learned that day what I had learned earlier. Love can be leveraged, but it can also be recalibrated. Trust is not an endless well. It is a river you learn to redirect when it's been dammed by deceit. The sun sank below the rooftops, and the cicadas began their steady chorus. Somewhere downtown, Chase was processing the first cold click of a holding room door. Here, on my porch, I processed something quieter, a return. Not to innocence, that was gone. Not to normal, that never existed. A return to alignment. My life and my name were back in the same sentence. I thought of Robert then, not as a ghost, but as a partner in absentia. The precautions he'd left, the allies he'd trusted, the intuition he always respected, everything had converged in this moment. I hadn't just survived a scheme, I had dismantled it with the kind of grace predators underestimate because they confuse gentleness with weakness. Night settled. I turned on the porch light not as a beacon for visitors, but as a quiet declaration. The house is occupied, the owner is alert, and the story is mine again. He had believed that calling the police would be my final humiliation. Instead, their arrival was the punctuation mark at the end of his illusion. The line had been crossed, the record was clear, and the next chapter would be written in a language he couldn't manipulate. Evidence, verdict, consequence. I finished my tea, let the last warmth pass me through, and closed the door on a day that belonged to justice. Tomorrow would bring court dates and statements. Tonight brought something rarer, stillness without fear.
Court felt less like a room and more like a refrigerated vault where truth is preserved, cataloged, and weighed. The air was crisp, the benches unforgiving, and everything echoed a fraction too long. I walked in wearing Robert's navy dress, the one that always made me feel like I had a spine made of ironwood. I wasn't there to be pitied. I was there to be heard. The prosecution built the story the way I had lived it, patiently, piece by piece. Recordings surfaced first, each one a time-stamped shard of intent. The jury listened to Chase outlining his timeline, his confidence palpable even through the thin veil of audio compression. They heard him reduce me to an obstacle, recast concern as leverage, and speak of my life in terms of transfer and compliance. His voice, so smooth in a living room, sounded brittle under fluorescent lights. Documents followed, the original packet, the revised version with our nullification clause, the bank's logs showing his attempt to seize control immediately after the dinner he considered his victory lap. Every paragraph he'd hoped I would skim became a spotlight pointed at his motive. Legalese turned into plain English when framed correctly, and I could see the shift in the juror's posture as each exhibit clicked into place. When it was my turn, the room did what rooms do when an old woman stands. Some leaned forward, some softened, some braced for fragility. I let the weight of that expectation hang for half a breath, then dismantled it with clarity. I explained what I saw at Thanksgiving, what I sensed in the days that followed, why the folder on my table was never just paper. I described the night I found the clause, the decision to involve Elaine, the construction of the recordings, the staging of the dinner, the trigger at the bank. I didn't dramatize. Facts told properly are dramatic enough. I framed myself not as a victim, but as a strategist forced into action to defend what grief had already taken once. I made it clear that aging had not eroded my mind, it had refined my patience. I let them understand that silence had been my tool, not my state. I made sure they knew this wasn't about money, it was about autonomy, about a name, about not being edited out of a narrative someone else wanted to control. Across the aisle, Chase sat smaller than I'd ever seen him. The suit didn't fit the way it had at Thanksgiving.
Confidence looks good in tailored fabric. Exposure does not. His attorney tried to reframe it: miscommunication, misinterpretation, mutual benefit. The argument scattered like dry leaves in a strong wind. You cannot repackage a recorded plan as a misunderstanding. Closing arguments rolled over the room like tides. Procedure took over. The jury filed out. Time became viscous. I sat still, hands folded, pulse steady. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already made peace with every outcome. Winning in court mattered, but I had already won the part that counted. I had refused to disappear. The verdict arrived with the kind of efficiency Chase had once used as a selling point. Guilty on all counts: attempted fraud, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and falsification for fiduciary gain. The words landed with a dull finality that didn't need applause. He stared ahead, uncomprehending for a breath too long, as if the system he thought he could bend had snapped back harder than he believed possible. I didn't celebrate. Courtrooms do not invite celebration. They demand exhalation. Mine came slowly, like air rising from deep water. I watched the judge set sentencing for a later date, watched the officers move into place, watched Chase stand when told. The cuffs were quiet, but their meaning carried. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. No lighter. Justice isn't weightless, but calibrated, balanced. I entered that building with my story on my shoulders. I left it set down in the record, preserved in ink and verdict. He had tried to erase me from the family ledger. Instead, his own actions had been etched into the public one. The courthouse steps were warmer than the courtroom benches. Reporters hovered at a distance, sensing a headline but unsure the angle. I kept walking. This wasn't for cameras. This was for the woman who sat at her kitchen table under a yellow light and refused to sign herself away. This was for the man who taught her to read fine print and trust her instincts. This was for the daughter who needed proof more than persuasion. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence felt earned. The trees along the road swayed like they were breathing with me. By the time I reached my driveway, the sun had shifted, casting long, honest shadows across the porch. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and understood something simple and seismic. My life was mine again, not because a jury said so, but because I never let it be otherwise. The trial was over. The sentence would come, but the reclamation, that had happened long before the gavel.
The envelope arrived with the weight of an ending and the grace of a beginning. Heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of formal dignity that says the world has taken notice. Inside was confirmation in black ink. Every authority remained mine, every transfer attempt void, every clause meant to cage me legally dissolved on contact with evidence. It wasn't news to my bones. My bones had known all along, but it mattered to see the law say aloud what I had held in silence. I was never gone. I placed the letter on Robert's old desk, right beside the cufflinks he wore to the board meeting where he refused to sell out a partner, and the fountain pen he used to sign our first mortgage. The desk creaked a little, as if exhaling with me. I let my fingers rest on the page, feeling the ridges of the notary stamp, the impression of the clerk's signature, the slight grain of the cardstock. Proof has texture. I had earned the right to feel it. Julia came later, sunflowers in her arms and thunderclouds in her eyes. The storm had passed, but the damage assessment was just beginning. For her, for us. She carried apology like something fragile, afraid it might shatter if she held it too tightly. I received it without ceremony. We didn't need speeches. She needed to see that trust could be repaired, not discarded. That love could be rewired, not erased. I gave her a place at my kitchen table, the same one where the folder once sat, and let presence do what words would only bruise. After she left, I moved through the house as if reintroducing myself to every room. Curtains were drawn wide, light poured in unchecked. For weeks I had curated an image of decline. Now I curated an image of ownership. I straightened the photo frames that had been deliberately skewed, put away the staged stack of unopened mail, tightened the cabinet hinge I had left loose for effect. Restoration became ritual. Each small correction felt like a stitch closing a wound I refused to let scar over crooked. I dusted the piano and lifted the fallboard. My fingers hovered for a moment over ivory that hadn't sung since Robert's last winter. The first notes were hesitant, the way a voice sounds after too long unspoken. Then memory took over, muscle, mind, marrow, and the melody found itself. The house listened. I let the music carry the tension out, note by note, like drawing poison with a steady hand. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed felt honest, not empty. With Elaine's help, I rewrote my estate documents, not from fear, but from defiance. Safeguards were installed like reinforced beams, contingencies for Julia's protection, provisions for causes that mattered, clauses that locked every door Chase had tried to open. My legacy was no longer a pile to be guarded, it was a fortress to be managed. I built it in my name, on my terms, with the kind of intentionality that comes from almost losing everything. I allowed myself a morning to breathe in the ordinary, fresh coffee, a newspaper folded just so, a stroll through the garden Robert once tended. The roses were leggy and defiant, growing in directions that ignored tidy design. I admired them for that. I clipped a few stems, thorns and all, and set them in water on the windowsill. Beauty without vulnerability is artificial. Strength without softness is sterile. I embraced both. The house was quiet that evening, but it wasn't silence that echoed. It was space. Room for thought, for rest, for whatever came next. I wasn't naive enough to believe predators disappear. They adapt. So do widows who refuse to be cornered. My victory wasn't a finish line. It was a foundation. I lit a single candle on the mantel, not for memory, but for presence. That small flame marked the place where fear had lived and been evicted. I wasn't celebrating a courtroom win. I was marking the moment I reclaimed authorship. My story had been nudged, edited, redrafted without consent. I had taken back the pen. Age had not made me invisible. It had made me precise. Loss had not broken me. It had refined me. Grief had not weakened me. It had widened me, given me room to hold both rage and restraint, strategy and tenderness, clarity and compassion. He had tried to erase me from the family ledger, to compress my life into paperwork and signatures. Instead, his attempt carved my name deeper into records, into law, into the memory of everyone who watched an old woman refuse to vanish. I went to bed that night with the windows open, letting the night sounds drift in. The crickets, a distant train, the soft hum of a world still spinning exactly as it should. My heartbeat matched the rhythm. I slept without staging, without pretending, without listening for footsteps that weren't mine. By morning, the letter lay where I left it, the ink dry, the decision final. I slipped it into a folder marked not estate or legal, but kept.
Some things are more than documents. They are declarations. My name was restored long before the verdict. The verdict simply framed it. And now, framed or not, it stays. With the verdict stamped and the papers filed, I turned my attention to something larger than recovery: design. Survival had demanded reaction. Legacy required intention. I sat at Robert's old desk with fresh ink and steadier hands than I'd had in months, and I began to rewrite the map of what would outlive me. Elaine brought drafts that read like architecture: load-bearing clauses, reinforced definitions, language that locked every hinge Chase had tried to pry open. We reshaped my estate into a fortress, with windows I could see through and doors no one could open without my key. Autonomy was no longer an assumption. It was a structure with alarms and contingencies. I built protections for Julia, not as a reprimand, but as a gift she wouldn't know she needed until life tested her again. Safeguards would cradle her without caging her. Funds were channeled into trusts that required transparency and time, not urgency and charm. I scattered landmines of accountability throughout the paperwork: annual audits, dual signatures, triggers that would freeze action at the first whiff of coercion. I wasn't just preventing another Chase. I was dismantling the ecosystem that feeds men like him. Beyond family, I carved out a portion for widows who wake up one morning and realize the wolves learn to wear the faces of their children's spouses. Grants for legal aid, emergency funds for those already trapped in facilities they never chose. A seed for a program that teaches aging women the language of power, so they never sign what they don't understand. Robert's money was always meant to protect. I finally redirected it from passive security to active defense. I could feel him in the room during those sessions, not as a ghost, but as a presence woven into the grain of the desk, the ink ribbon of the old typewriter, the dent on the floorboard where his chair always sat. He had trusted me to would rather wage war than surrender. Now I honored that by making sure the battle standard wouldn't fall when I did. In the evenings, when the legal language blurred at the edges, I opened the cedar chest in the guest room, the one that held letters, photographs, fragments of a life layered in paper. I found half-written notes I'd never mailed, thoughts I'd saved for quiet mornings that never came. Some were to Robert, others to Julia at ages that feel both close and prehistoric. I didn't burn them or bury them or frame them. I filed them behind the new documents, a private archive of the heart beside the fortress of the mind. One afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my property with a pruning shear in hand. The shrubs had grown unruly during the weeks I spent strategizing indoors. I trimmed deliberately, shaping edges without stripping life. It felt like metaphor made real, growth allowed, chaos contained. The roses fought me, thorns catching my gloves, stems refusing symmetry. I let them. Beauty can bruise, resilience often does. When the final draft was ready, I signed with the same name someone had once tried to sell off. The pen moved easily this time. No tremor, no performance, no audience. Just ink, intention, and a final stroke that turned reaction into authorship. The folder that once held my erasure now sat beneath a new binder labeled in my hand, Legacy, Final, Mine. I slid it into the safe, closed the door, and listened to the bolt slide home. The sound was small, but it echoed like resolve.
I slept that night with a different kind of stillness, not the emptiness after battle, but the fullness after building. The world could shift again. People could scheme again, but the foundation was poured, cured, and etched with a truth no clause could overturn. I am the keeper of my own story, and now so is the law.
Peace did not arrive like a parade. It settled like dust after demolition. Slow, quiet, inevitable. The house stopped feeling like a set and started feeling like a home again. I could stand in the doorway of each room without calculating sight lines or imagining microphones. The air moved differently. My shoulders dropped without asking permission. Stillness returned. But it was a stillness I chose, not the kind forced on me by fear. Morning became mine again. Not the mechanical mornings of strategy, but the soft ones that unfold with coffee steam and newspaper ink. I let the kettle whistle a little too long because urgency no longer dictated my rhythm. I read whole articles instead of scanning for threat. I underlined passages that stirred me for reasons other than survival. The crossword filled slowly, not as a mental drill, but as a meditation. I turned the page without checking if someone had slipped something between the sheets. Trust cautiously crept back in, not in people yet, but in moments. In the garden, the ground forgave neglect with steady persistence. I pressed my fingers into the soil and felt the pulse of something older than schemes. Weeds surrendered under steady hands. New shoots defied careful pruning. I let a few stay. Imperfection belongs somewhere, and this time it would not be in my paperwork. Dirt lodged under my nails and stayed there as proof that not everything needed gloves and contingency plans. I visited Robert's grave with a different posture, not hunched with lingering grief or squared with fresh fury, but upright with completion. I spoke without words, in the way widows do when love lingers beyond breath. The promise I made at his desk about using what he left to protect what we built felt honored. The fear that I had failed him dissolved. I left a single rose from the unruly bush by the fence, thorns intact, because beauty earned by blood is honest. Elaine and I shifted from daily calls to scheduled check-ins, the way soldiers step down from the front but keep their rifles cleaned. We laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because relief sometimes sounds like that. The binder labeled Legacy, Final, Mine stayed in the safe, but I could walk past it without the urge to open and recheck. Reinforced steel and notarized signatures now shared the burden with my bones. In the afternoons, I began walking the neighborhood again. Familiar sidewalks felt newly mapped. People waved, some with curiosity, a few with whispered admiration they thought I couldn't see. Rumors had done their work, and while I didn't court attention, I accepted the nods from women who looked at me the way soldiers look at each other across crowds. Recognition without biography. A few asked for resources, quietly. I pointed them to numbers, names, steps. The fortress I built was never meant to be mine alone. I let myself reclaim small pleasures that had been set aside in the heat of vigilance. Bread proofed on the counter, rising without supervision. A book was read cover to cover on the couch, not in a leather chair angled for optimal surveillance. I played the piano at odd hours,
sometimes stumbling, sometimes soaring, always grateful that sound could fill a space where suspicion once lived. Peace, I realized, is not silence. It is the absence of tension dressed as calm. At night, I slept with the windows cracked, letting the outside world breathe into mine. The crickets returned to their chorus. Distant sirens belonged to someone else's story. The house creaked in familiar ways, not like a stranger moving through it. My dreams lost their courtroom edges. They loosened into color and memory, not strategy and timestamps. But I did not mistake peace for permanent safety. I installed it the way one installs good locks, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for reality. Documents were audited, systems tested, passwords changed, allies kept close. I calibrated my life to live freely without presenting myself gift-wrapped to the next opportunist. Vigilance became a habit, not a burden. It was folded into my days like a stitched hem, visible only if you know where to look. The world moved on as it always does. Headlines shifted. New scandals surfaced. Chase faded into the paperwork of the justice system. I didn't track his every hearing or appeal. That was the court's job now. My job was my life, my name, my breath, my garden, my music, my daughter who sat across from me more often now, her posture softer, her questions deeper, her trust rebuilding one unremarkable afternoon at a time. Peace did not erase what happened. It made space for it to matter without consuming me. The battle was over. The war had taught me too much to pretend I could live as if it never happened, so I chose something in between. The posture of a woman who rests with her eyes open, not from fear, but from wisdom. I ended the day with a candle lit on the mantel, not as a vigil, but as a marker. This house is occupied. This life is claimed. This name is spoken. The flame flickered, steady and alive, a quiet declaration that the story had not ended, it had simply changed chapters. Silence once threatened to bury me. Now I use it to listen only for what matters.
The aftermath became a beginning I hadn't planned for, but recognized the moment it arrived. Justice had been served. Peace installed, legacy rewritten, yet something in me refused to retreat into quiet comfort. Survival had sharpened more than my defenses. It had honed my purpose. I understood now that what I rebuilt for myself could be scaled for others, that a fortress is most powerful when its blueprints are shared. I started small, the way all lasting things do. A checklist for widows who suspect manipulation, a plain language guide to powers of attorney and hidden clauses, a list of questions to ask before signing anything, written in margins large enough for shaking hands. I sent packets anonymously at first, to churches, community centers, retirement groups. The responses came back like echoes. Thank yous tinged with fear, stories folded in shame, relief masked as gratitude. I realized shame was the second predator, arriving after the first one failed or succeeded. I aimed for that one too. Elaine and I formalized what we had improvised. Workshops emerged, then a fund, then a network of attorneys willing to take late-night calls from women who felt something was off but couldn't name it yet. My phone became a triage line, quiet, relentless, important. I learned how to listen for the breaks in sentences where danger hides, how to translate trembling into action, how to remind strangers that being underestimated is not the same as being powerless.
Julia watched me build, sometimes helping, sometimes simply sitting near, learning through proximity. Our relationship settled into a new terrain, flatter, steadier, honest. She asked for copies of the guides, took notes of her own, learned how to read the language she had once trusted blindly. We did not dwell on what she missed. We invested in what she would now see. Love re-entered the room with its sleeves rolled up. I visited the courthouse again, not as a plaintiff, but as an observer. I watched other cases unfold, different faces, same patterns. I saw the look I recognized in the eyes of women on the stand, that blend of rage and restraint, of exhaustion and precision. Sometimes I stayed after to press a folded sheet of paper into a palm. Sometimes I left without a word. Presence itself can be a resource when the world tries to make you feel singular. At home, the binder in the safe became one of many. I documented procedures like recipes, stored templates like heirlooms, archived recordings of my own voice explaining where cracks tend to form. I turned my experience into curriculum, because curriculum outlives memory. I hosted gatherings at my dining table that once held a manila folder, and we filled it with strategy instead of silence. The yard grew wilder by design. I let vines climb the trellis unchecked, left a patch of grass high for the butterflies, allowed the roses to sprawl in defiance of neat borders. There was beauty in allowing life to refuse containment, as long as the foundation beneath was secure. Control belonged on paper now. Freedom could live in the soil. At night, I wrote. Not memoir. Those belong to people who want to be remembered. I wrote instructions, scripts for phone calls reporting fraud, templates for letters to banks, flowcharts for legal processes that swallow the uninitiated. I reduced fear to step-by-step lists. I put arrows where panic usually sits. I turned dread into ink, then into action. The candle on the mantel was replaced by a small brass lamp. Solid, direct, not easily blown out. I lit it whenever someone called with a story that started like mine. It became a ritual. Lamp on, notes out, voice steady. When the call ended, I turned it off, not to forget, but to rest. Even torches need tending. I did not become a crusader. Crusades are loud, and loudness was never my weapon. I became a signal. A quiet frequency predators learn to fear, and vulnerable people learn to find. My name found its way into spaces I never entered. I heard it once at the grocery store whispered over cantaloupes by two women comparing legal documents. I smiled and kept walking. The point was never recognition. It was replication. Years folded in on themselves the way well-worn maps do at the creases. I grew older in the ordinary way, slower stairs, softer bones, quicker naps. But I did not grow small. The work adjusted to my pace without losing momentum. Systems tend to perpetuate themselves once built well. I only had to maintain them, not carry them. Others carried with me. That was the plan all along. On a late autumn evening, I stood at the edge of the garden, the sky bruised with sunset, the air cool with the first hints of winter. The house behind me glowed, not with vigilance, but with life. A piano melody drifting from the living room, the clink of dishes, the murmur of a television left on low. I felt the weight of everything that had happened, not as burden, but as ballast, steadying, necessary. I realized then that erasure was his goal because permanence was mine. He aimed to remove me quietly so he could move freely. I had done the opposite. I rooted myself publicly so others could stand. He lost his freedom. I found mine expanded in directions neither of us predicted. I walked back inside, turned off the lamp, and let the dark settle like velvet, gentle, encompassing, safe. Tomorrow might bring another call, another woman at the end of a line holding a pen over a signature she does not trust. I would be ready,
Not because I live in battle stance, but because building makes readiness a habit. Peace remained. Silence did not. I filled the quiet with purpose and left enough space for rest. The torch stayed lit, not as a flare, but as a lighthouse, fixed and unwavering. He tried to erase me from the family. I became a landmark instead. If anyone ever nudged you to the edge of your own story, remember this: your voice is still yours. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, share your experience, and make sure you're here for the next story. Hit subscribe, because the predators aren't done, and neither am I.